The American government was anxious to avoid the previous generation's mistakes by not over-punishing World War II's losers the way the Allies had Germany after World War I, even though Germany was more clearly to blame for World War II than they had been for World War I. The real motive for America's post-war generosity in Asia and Europe was to rebuild societies in their image that provided a better alternative than communism. They aimed to displace the potential for communism in Japan and Western Europe with democratic capitalism and succeeded. Despite 5 years of violent conflict, Japan quickly became America's biggest Pacific ally, an ideological dam against communism, as former President Herbert Hoover called it. Germany's heavy indebtedness only helped sink the world economy in the 1930s and led to Nazism. This time, the US rebuilt West Germany's economy as best it could, hoping for a strong ally in the heart of Europe, and wrote off a big chunk of the debt they still owed from the Versailles Settlement of 1919. The US didn't control Western Europe the way the Soviets did the Eastern Bloc, but they fended off communism and built up industry. They even hired ex-Nazi snipers to assassinate communist leaders. In Asia, General Douglas MacArthur oversaw reconstruction efforts in Japan during the American occupation of 1945 to 1952, revitalizing industry, purging labor unions of leftists, Japan's Red Purge, and writing a new constitution. As we'll see below, America also established a series of bilateral one-to-one security agreements in Asia with Japan, South Korea, and unofficially Taiwan, whereas in Western Europe they crafted a multilateral alliance called NATO, all integral to present-day diplomacy. Cold War, the open yet restricted rivalry that developed after World War II between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. The Cold War was waged on political, economic, and propaganda fronts and had only limited recourse to weapons. The term was first used by the English writer George Orwell in an article published in 1945 to refer to what he predicted would be a nuclear stalemate between 2 or 3 monstrous superstates, each possessed of a weapon by which millions of people can be wiped out in a few seconds. It was first used in the United States by the American financier and presidential advisor Bernard Baruch in a speech at the State House in Columbia, South Carolina in 1947. Origins of the Cold War. Following the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945 near the close of World War II, the uneasy wartime alliance between the United States and Great Britain on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other began to unravel. By 1948, the Soviets had installed left-wing governments in the countries of Eastern Europe that had been liberated by the Red Army. The Americans and the British feared the permanent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the threat of Soviet-influenced communist parties coming to power in the democracies of Western Europe. The Soviets, on the other hand, were determined to maintain control of Eastern Europe to safeguard against any possible renewed threat from Germany. And they were intent on spreading communism worldwide, largely for ideological reasons. The Cold War had solidified by 1947-1948, when U.S. aid provided under the Marshall Plan to Western Europe had brought those countries under American influence, and the Soviets had installed openly communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The struggle between superpowers. The Cold War reached its peak in 1948 to 1953. In this period, the Soviets unsuccessfully blockaded the Western-held sectors of West Berlin. The United States and its European allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO, a unified military command to resist the Soviet presence in Europe. The Soviets exploded their first atomic warhead, thus ending the American monopoly on the atomic bomb. The Chinese Communists came to power in mainland China, and the Soviet-supported Communist government of North Korea invaded US-supported South Korea in 1950, setting off an indecisive Korean War that lasted until 1953. From 1953 to 1957, Cold War tensions relaxed somewhat, largely owing to the death of the longtime Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin in 1953. Nevertheless, the standoff remained. A unified military organization among the Soviet bloc countries, the Warsaw Pact, was formed in 1955, and West Germany was admitted into NATO that same year. Another intense stage of the Cold War was in 1958 to 1962. The United States and the Soviet Union began developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, and in 1962 the Soviets began secretly installing missiles in Cuba that could be used to launch nuclear attacks on U.S. cities. This sparked the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a confrontation that brought the two superpowers to the brink of war before an agreement was reached to withdraw the missiles. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union were ready to use nuclear weapons for fear of the other's retaliation and thus of mutual atomic annihilation. The two superpowers soon signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which banned above-ground nuclear weapons testing. But the crisis also hardened the Soviets' determination never again to be humiliated by their military inferiority, and they began a buildup of both conventional and strategic forces that the United States was forced to match for the next 25 years. Throughout the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct military confrontation in Europe and engaged in actual combat operations only to keep allies from defecting to the other side or to overthrow them after they had done so. Thus, the Soviet Union sent troops to preserve communist rule in East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Afghanistan. For its part, the United States helped overthrow a left-wing government in Guatemala in 1954, supported an unsuccessful invasion of Cuba 1961, invaded the Dominican Republic 1965 and Grenada 1983, and undertook a long 1954 to 1975 and unsuccessful effort to prevent communist North Vietnam from bringing South Vietnam under its rule, toward a new world order. In the course of the 1960s and 70s, however, the bipolar struggle between the Soviet and American blocs gave way to a more complicated pattern of international relationships, in which the world was no longer split into two opposed blocs. A major split occurred between the Soviet Union and China in 1960 and widened over the years, shattering the unity of the communist bloc. In the meantime, Western Europe and Japan achieved dynamic economic growth in the 1950s and 60s, reducing their relative inferiority to the United States. Less powerful countries had more room to assert their independence and often showed themselves resistant to superpower coercion or cajoling. The 1970s saw an easing of Cold War tensions as events in the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks SALT that led to the SALT-I and IO agreements of 1972 and 1979 respectively, in which the two superpowers set limits on their anti-ballistic missiles and on their strategic missiles capable of carrying nuclear weapons. That was followed by a period of renewed Cold War tensions in the early 1980s as the two superpowers continued their massive arms buildup and competed for influence in the Third World. However, the Cold War began to break down in the late 1980s during the administration of Soviet leader Mikhail S. Gorbachev. He dismantled the totalitarian aspects of the Soviet system and began efforts to democratize the Soviet political system. When communist regimes in the Soviet bloc countries of Eastern Europe collapsed in 1989-1990, Gorbachev acquiesced in their fall. The rise to power of democratic governments in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia was quickly followed by the unification of West and East Germany under NATO auspices, again with Soviet approval. Gorbachev's internal reforms had meanwhile weakened his own Communist Party and allowed power to shift to Russia and the other constituent republics of the Soviet Union. In late 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and 15 newly independent nations were born from its corpse, including Russia with a democratically elected anti-communist leader. The Cold War had come to an end. The space race was a 20th century competition between two Cold War adversaries, the Soviet Union and the United States, to achieve superior spaceflight capability. It had its origins in the ballistic missile-based nuclear arms race between the two nations following World War II. The space race brought pioneering launches of artificial satellites and robotic space probes to the Moon, Venus, and Mars, and human spaceflight in low Earth orbit, and ultimately to the Moon. The Sandinista-Contra conflict began after Sandinista rebels overthrew the government of longtime American-backed Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza in 1979. American President Ronald Reagan stopped aid to Nicaragua and the Sandinista government, claiming the Soviets and other communist groups supported the Sandinistas. In 1981, Reagan secretly authorized funding to the anti-Sandinista Contra fighters stationed in Honduras and Costa Rica. Fighting between the Sandinista and Contras continued throughout the 1980s. The result of the Sandinista-Contras conflict: after a decade of fighting in 1989, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega met with the leaders of neighboring Latin American countries and developed a peace plan. Nations with Contra bases agreed to close those bases down if Ortega allowed free and fair elections in Nicaragua. The Ortega government held these elections in February 1990. Opposition candidate Violeta Barrios de Chamorro defeated Ortega, and the Sandinistas also lost control of the Nicaraguan Congress. Do you like it? Kindly give your valuable response in our comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting and informative